Welcome to the Quantum Biology Collective podcast, where we break down the practical strategies of this emerging science, starting with healthy light habits and going wherever the quantum superhighway takes us. This is your host, executive and life coach Meredith Oak, with a quick reminder that podcasts are conversations, not consultations, and definitely not medical advice. We're here for informational purposes only. To follow up with our amazing guests, please do check out the show notes, and to stay in the loop with the QBC podcast, join our email list, also linked in the show notes. In this podcast, we focus a lot on light and how healthy light, natural light is integral to every aspect of our biology and every aspect of our health. And we've started to understand that we're filled with mitochondria, which are little clocks and little sensors that are continuously sensing the environment around them and using that information to make decisions on what they should be doing in our systems. And so when people really start to understand that that's how human biology really works, other questions start to arise, such as, okay, well, if light is so important, what about sound? Does sound have a similar type of effect on our biology? And the answer is yes. So anybody who's ever, lay down in front of a meditation gong or gone to a sound healer or even just had a dance party to change your mood, we know that sound also has a very, very profound effect on us. And today's guest is one of the foremost researchers in the world on this topic. He studies a topic called cymatics. His name is Stuart Reid. He has recently launched an institute around cymatics, and he is the inventor of a device called the cymascope, which is used in universities and labs all over the world to really start to understand the connection between sound and biology and sound and life itself. So Stuart Reid is a lovely person. He does get quite technical. So if it goes over your head a little bit, I have to admit some of it went over my head. Don't worry about it. Just let it wash over you. He always brings it back to something really interesting and practical, and his experiences have just been super profound. I definitely listen to the end where he talks about his experience inside the Egyptian pyramids. If you are new to the podcast and this is one of the first episodes you're listening to, I definitely recommend going to the show notes and clicking the link to join our email list. And you will get an email with a little guide to some of our more basic episodes that will walk you through some of the more foundational aspects of what we talk about here. Because I will say this episode is pretty intense, but it is deeply fascinating and really led me to reconsider the origins of life itself. So enjoy. Right. Stuart Reid, welcome to the Quantum Biology Collective podcast. I'm very excited to have this conversation. And I remember seeing a video of cymatics, and I don't even remember when, 10, 15 years ago. And there was it was like a kind of a viscous clay, and the sound played, and the clay almost started walking. I don't know if you know what video. And I was like, oh my goodness. It just was one of those moments that frozen in time for me. So I was like,
Well, I'm so glad that you were inspired, and thank you very much for inviting me on your show, on your podcast. Though actually, what you're referring to there is, well, the technical term for it is non-Newtonian fluid, which basically just like flour and water mixed together. What happens is when you excite that with sound, you get these lovely little kind of fingers that rise up out of the fluid, very viscous, as you say, and they dance around. And many years ago, actually, Meredith, I created a video with the Sorcerer's Apprentice, Paul Ducas's beautiful music.
Yes, yes.
And anyway, it's kind of like, seeing those broomsticks moving. Mm-hmm. It's this thing with the fingers, they kind of loll around, and it is very, very strange to view that. But much more beautiful, I would say, is kind of regular cymatics, where the geometry of, say, music is brought to life. And obviously, this is part of what I know you would like to talk about today.
Yes. So could you just give us the short definition of what cymatics is, and then what it looks like in practice? When you have the plate with some material on it and the sound introduced.
Sure, I'd love to do that. Well, the basic principle of cymatics is really simple. Whenever sound is present, which, by the way, in this world is all of the time, because you can never get away from sound, really. The only place where there's virtually no sound is in what's termed an anechoic chamber, which is, like a laboratory specially prepared chamber. And even in there is sound, but of course it's very, very low level. But generally in the world, there's always sound. Well, the basic principle of cymatics is that whenever sound is present and there is a membrane present, then there must be a pattern of acoustic energy imprinted onto that membrane. I liken it sometimes to a fingerprint on glass. You know how if you put a finger or a thumb print onto a glass, regular glass, it's virtually invisible. I mean, you've got to really struggle to see it sometimes. But if you sprinkle on some fine powder, like talcum powder, for example, then it becomes readily available. You've actually revealed it, haven't you? And this is one of the forensic science principles. Well, it's a similar sort of thing with sound. If you now think about, for example, the surface of water, it has a surface tension, and it's very, very flexible, that surface tension. Well, now if you think about imprinting sounds, vibrations onto the surface of that water, then it will create a pattern of energy, acoustic energy. However, it is virtually invisible. But let's just, before we get a little bit more into that, let's just take a step back and talk about where all of this original science came from, because really, it was kickstarted really by Ernst Chladni, who was a German physicist and musician. And it's a really powerful combination when you've got that scientific mind coupled with, being a musician as well. Anyway, it was Ernst Chladni who's been remembered in history for really kickstarting this whole science. And it is really an emergent science, even though Chladni, we're talking about around about 1800 when he really popularized this whole idea of making sound visible. In his case, he used a metal plate, like a brass square plate, and he played it with a violin bow. In other words, he played the edge of the plate with a violin bow. First of all, though, of course, he would sprinkle some form of powder, maybe sand, for example, on the plate, and then play the edge of the plate, therefore exciting the plate sonically, so with sound. And whenever you do that, it's the same as I've just been describing. The basic principle is whenever sound is present and there's a membrane present, then there must be, in this case, a cymatic pattern created on that membrane. Now, you might not think, most people I think would not think of a brass plate as being a flexible medium. Water, yes, obviously, it's pretty obvious that water is going to be very flexible, the surface tension. But a brass plate, well, indeed it is, a brass plate or any kind of metal plate for that matter is really quite flexible. And so when especially if it's a thin plate, like maybe, well, certainly no more than a 16th of an inch thick, or maybe up to about an 1/8 of an inch thick, maybe a millimeter or two in metric terms. But if you excite that plate with a violin bow or by any other means with a sound, then it will create a pattern of energy that will then become visible if you sprinkle on some fine powder such as sand or salt. I typically today use salt because it's obviously non-toxic, and even if a child happens to get a hold of it, it doesn't really do them any harm. So anyway, then that reveals that pattern of energy. Now, it's always, in the case of a harmonic sound, it's always a harmonious picture to observe. You know, pattern is structured geometrically, it's symmetrical, it's very beautiful actually on the eye. And so the principle, that is this essential principle. What you might not think of is all of the membranes that exist in your own body, right?
Yeah.
Your own skin is a membrane. Every cell in your body that has a membrane, and by the way, that's almost every cell, only your brain cells, your neurons, don't actually have membranes. All the other cells, and there are trillions and trillions of them in your body, they all have membranes. And this is one of the reasons why sound therapy and music medicine, which, you know, I love to talk about those subjects as well. It's one of the reasons why they are so efficacious when it comes to catalyzing or stimulating the body's innate healing response. So in other words, sound comes into your body, it penetrates your body, and literally creates cymatic patterns on every cell in your body that has a membrane, right? So let's just imagine for a moment that we are immersed in a beautiful soundscape. And I'm not talking now about listening through headphones, Meredith. I'm talking about full body immersion, you know, from a speaker system, for example, or live music, even better. But when those sound vibrations penetrate into your body, now always visualize these beautiful patterns that are surrounding all of your cell membranes. And because, I'm not getting into the technicalities too deeply here, but because sound always has what are called phase changes in it, therefore the cymatic pattern is not static. It's never simply static around the membrane of your cells. It's rotating all of the time. And one of the aspects of cells that, you know, probably most listeners and viewers are not aware of is that, unless you're a biologist, that is, from the cell membrane in your body, there are little what are termed IMPs, integral membrane proteins, that project from the cell membrane. And this is the way the cells communicate with their brothers and sister cells. It's the way that they take in nutrients, the way that they excrete food products and so on, waste materials. And so when this cymatic pattern gently rotates because of the phase changes in the music, rotates around the cell membrane, now you can visualize that the nodal points, the antinodal points in this rotating cymatic pattern will now gently massage the IMPs, right? So I can go into a lot of depth on this, but you get the general idea,
right?
That cymatics is not just something pretty for us to observe. It actually has medical applications and many other applications in the world.
Yes. And I do want to talk about that, because that's what sort of this podcast is about. It's like, oh, this cool new science, but what are the practical applications? What does it mean for us? And so I'm looking at the videos that you have online of the cyma plate. So it's like a plate. It's still, you sprinkle on salt. It's in a random pattern. You turn on the sound, and the salt spontaneously organizes itself into a beautiful geometric pattern. And I will put the link to this video in the show notes. I know a lot of people listen while they're driving or doing the dishes, but it's really worth going to take a look at. And so what you're saying is that same phenomenon is happening inside of our bodies with our cells whenever we're exposed to sound, which is all the time.
It is indeed. You know, you're referring there to what I now term a cyma plate, as opposed to the original Chladni plate. But simply put, yes, sound will organize matter on the surface of in this case, a metal plate. But when I began experimenting with cymatics a long time ago now, it's getting almost 25 years ago, and this happened actually in Egypt's Great Pyramid, where I was performing a series of, what turned out to be life-changing experiments with cymatics. But I very quickly realized after that what we needed to do was to create a new type of scientific instrument that could make sound visible, a calibrated instrument, basically, to make it useful for science. But very quickly, within, well, say 2 years, because I worked with particulate matter, sand and salt and other types of, particulate for about 2 years with an instrument, an actual calibrated instrument that I designed and developed, before I realized that this was never going to produce the kind of levels of detail. And it was very 2D, of course, it's two-dimensional when you're talking about particulate matter on a plate or a membrane of any kind. It's very two-dimensional. So I very quickly realized this is not the way to go, John, So I then began experimenting with liquids, and ultimately, we ended up with pure water. I tried so many different kinds of liquids, including, by the way, Scotch whiskey, which has one benefit, Meredith, which is that, you get a little tipple after the experiment. Don't waste the whiskey. But it turned out that pure water, and the purer the water, the better, is now the imaging medium that we use in what we now call the cymascope instrument. So cymascope is now a very well accepted instrument in science circles. It's in many universities in the world, and also private research institutions are using it across many different science disciplines. So, I'm very, very proud actually to have been able to bring that to science, and to watch now, almost sit back to some degree to watch other scientists use it, in their own disciplines. So it's a really fascinating.
That's incredible. So this version of I don't know, feels wrong to call it a machine, the cymaplate. So it uses water instead of particulate matter. And what has been the outcome of switching to water? And does this relate to the work of like Emoto and people who look at the shapes in water that have been held in memory?
Yeah, I think you're referring to Dr. Emoto's crystallization process, where he was able to show that water has a memory that it can, when it's frozen, it can actually reveal. It's a similar sort of principle, but of course now we're talking about frozen water as opposed to liquid water. Mm-hmm. So let's just, talk a little bit more about the cymascope instrument as opposed to the cyma plate or the Chladni plate, which is just a metal plate with sand or salt or other medium. With the cymascope instrument, which is a calibrated scientific instrument, it uses a small volume of water. Now, the huge benefit of using water as a medium for imprinting sound into it or onto the surface, it isn't only on the surface, it's also right throughout the depths of the water. So when we have a camera, for example, looking down into the water of the cymascope instrument, what the camera sees is not just the surface pattern, because obviously there is a surface pattern. What we talk about in scientific terminology is that we have converted sonic periodicities, these are the vibrations of sound, into water wavelet periodicities. In other words, we've transposed the vibrations of sound into a model or an analog of that sound, but now in little wavelets on the surface of the water. I think that's, fairly easy to understand. But what's not so obvious is that this imprinting of the sound onto the water isn't only a surface phenomenon. It goes literally right throughout the whole depth of the water. So when the camera is looking down into the water, it's seeing different layers of organization, not just surface, but right into the depths, right? So why is that important? Well, so now we're not talking about a two-dimensional imaging of sound. We're now talking about a 3D, or let's say quasi 3D imaging of sound. which has obviously far more data in it than a simple 2D pattern would have, right? But then if we now translate that into what happens in our body, of course, our body is a large percentage of water, right? So
Yes.
in
I was
addition,
just thinking that we're filled with
in
membranes, but we're
addition,
also filled with water. So the
exactly.
water becomes coherent with sound inputs.
That's
With
right. So, in addition to the cymatic patterns that are imprinting on every cellular membrane, which I mentioned earlier there, in addition to that, of course, we have visceral waters that are surrounding all of our organs, right? And now imagine that as we're immersed in a musical environment, say, that those beautiful harmonious sounds are now literally organizing the trillions and trillions, well, countless water molecules in your body into great beauty. And again, this has medical implications. It's not just pretty patterns or, pretty organization.
mm-hmm.
There are medical benefits to this. So when people talk about, well, today, one of the new clinical terms is music medicine, which is very exciting for me, to know that hospital, clinicians are actually starting to talk about the therapeutic aspects of music without the intervention of a therapist. So traditionally, well, going back certainly to the 1950s, music therapy has been rising in popularity, right? And this is where a therapist, a trained therapist, will work with a patient, on a one-to-one basis. They will help the patient choose music. Obviously, the best music is the patient's own choice, but they will navigate that with them. But there will also be a very strong element of talk therapy, a little bit like a psychologist, but
Mm-hmm.
using the power of music as well, right? That is a
Right.
very proven modality, a therapeutic modality in hospital settings. But of course, the problem with that, Meredith, if we can call it that, is that there'll never, ever be enough music therapists to go around. If you think about all the hospitals in the world, there are millions and millions of patients all in hospital settings now, right now. And of course, maybe a few thousand music therapists. So there's, the ratio of music therapists to patients is,
Yes.
we're never going to have enough music therapists. So this is a really great step forward for medical science, that they have come to realize that music has therapeutic ability even without the therapist, even without the talk therapy. So
Right.
many mechanisms, biological mechanisms in the body are catalyzed or stimulated by musical frequencies. And if you wanted to, I could talk about
Right.
that subject as well.
Yes, no, I think it would I think we will, because we talk on this podcast a lot about um having a healthy light environment. And the reason why is exactly what you just said about having listening to beautiful music, or having a coherent sound framework to operate in. It's bringing coherence into the cells. So does the cymascope, when you say that it's helping move sound medicine forward, is it able to show that people who were unwell or sick, and then they were exposed to sound therapy or music therapy, and then do they show different outcomes under the cymascope afterward? Is that some of the work that's being done, or along those lines?
Not exactly, but I'll give you a couple of examples where the cymascope instrument has been hugely helpful in medical science. The first concerns a study that actually I conducted myself with Professor Sungchul Ji of Rutgers University in the US. He came here, we worked together in the lab on a project. This project concerned imaging, making visible the sounds emitted from cancer cells and healthy cells, right? So
Wow.
you're probably not aware of
So I
this.
just want to pause for a second. So you're saying that our cells create sound. There's the sound of a
Exactly.
cell.
Yeah, exactly. So
Amazing. That's
it
so
is. Well,
cool.
this
Okay.
science was kickstarted by Professor James Jim Zuski from UCLA, around 2002. So it's over 20 years old, this science. He was the first scientist to discover that cells have a song. They have their own song. And the reason that this happens is, if you think of the metabolic processes that are going on inside every cell, thousands of biochemical reactions that are happening every second of the day and night. And all of these biochemical reactions combined create sound. And the sound that's created is not simple. It's actually quite a complex sound. And he was the guy who actually termed it a song, right? It's kind of poetic, but it's really lovely. Mm. And what happens is the membrane of the cell literally vibrates up and down. It kind of respirates with its song. Now, as it turned out, the songs of cells in our body are all in the audible range. So let's give you an example of sort of 1,000 hertz. 1 kilohertz would be a kind of center frequency for most of the songs of cells. So in other words, there'll be frequencies above 1 kilohertz and frequencies below it, but nevertheless, a complex array of frequencies that the cell is emitting. And it turns out that cancer cells have a completely different song to healthy cells. And when we make those visible, as we did with Professor G in the lab here, and we made visible the sounds of cancer cells and healthy cells, it turns out they're completely different. And so this is really exciting research, because there are two avenues that we're looking at. The first is to create a new type of tool for surgeons that can allow them to remove fully a tumor. When they're taking a tumor out of someone's body, apparently, and I'm not a surgeon, but apparently it's actually quite a tricky operation to determine where does the cancer tissue terminate and where does the healthy tissue begin. And so they obviously want to get all of the tumor out. And it is quite tricky to do. And very often a few cancer cells will be left behind. And it's pretty obvious what will happen when,
right. Those buggers like to grow.
Yeah, they do indeed. So the idea with this, Meredith, is that there will be a new type of tool. It's based on what's termed Raman spectroscopy, which is a form of being able to listen in effectively to the sounds of tissues, in this case, using a little laser probe. So this laser probe would be kind of manually scanned across the tissues as the surgeon is working. And he or she would have specially adapted eyewear with a little camera in it that will allow them to see exactly where the margins of the tumor lie, because of the cymatic principle that I've been talking about, that when you make the sound of a cancer cell visible or the sound of a healthy cell, they're completely different patterns. One is very harmonious, the healthy cell.
Okay, this is so great. So the cancer cell has a different song. I love that it's called a song. A different song to a healthy cell. And given the principles of cymatics, we know that we can make that sound visible. Right. So the surgeons have specialized eyewear, so they can literally see where the cancer cells are based on the sounds that they're emitting. And so when they know they've got it all out, because they don't see that sound coming out anymore.
That's right. And they don't see the pattern either. That's the pattern that's more important.
The pattern. I see. The song is creating a specific cancer pattern.
Yep. So if they don't see that pattern anymore, they know they've got it all, right? So that's one application, a very important one, but it could actually lead ultimately to complete eradication of all cancers. Now, I'm not going to go into any great depth here, because there's intellectual property involved, but it's very, very exciting prospect that cymatics could lead ultimately to a future in which cancer has been eradicated completely. And I'm not just talking about tumors here. I'm talking about cancers like leukemia and other forms of, blood cancers and so on. So then moving on from that,
okay,
quickly
Okay,
sidestep
now that we've cured cancer, what's next?
Moving on from that, again, working with Professor Sung-Chul Ji, another experiment that we worked together on was something that I had a hunch about, Meredith, for many years, and it basically came from well, about 500 BCE, where Pythagoras, Pythagoras of Samos, said that music could be used in place of medicine. This is an actual direct quote. Well, he didn't write that, but apparently one of his biographers called Iamblichus did write it down. And so it's come down to us in history that Pythagoras said music could be used in place of medicine. Well, I came to realize many years ago that had never really been well tested, in medical science. So I was lying in bed one day. I get some of my best ideas when I'm just waking up in the morning. Maybe it's the same for you, Meredith. But anyway, this morning I got this idea, that I could create an experiment with human blood that would test this, I suppose we'd be calling it a hypothesis, because it hadn't really been properly tested. So I spoke with Sung-Chul Ji about it, and we came to realize that it would be a really great project. So he came here again, worked for several days to design a protocol to run this experiment. And what came out of that was very exciting. So first of all, just very briefly describe the experiment, which is extremely simple. You take a test tube of human blood, whole human blood, and then decant it into two smaller test tubes. Also warm it, of course, because when it arrives here from the blood donor bank, it's chilled. So we warm it up to normal blood temperature. Then we decant into two smaller test tubes. One test tube goes into our laboratory Faraday cage, which is actually an electromagnetically screened cage, so no electromagnetics can get in. No telephone calls, no television, no radio, no electromagnetic signals at all can get into that cage. But also in there, it's very, very quiet, a little bit like an anechoic chamber, not quite as quiet as that, but pretty quiet, like certainly quieter than the quietest bedroom you can think of. So really quiet environment. So that blood goes in an incubator at blood temperature in that quiet environment for 20 minutes. The other little vial of blood, the other test tube, goes into an incubator in our lab here. Actually, we've got one right behind me right now. This is the incubator here. Just turn that on, look. So you can see this is an incubator where we have a small speaker. Can you see the little speaker here?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So there we can now play music, literally music, to the blood. And the idea of the experiment was, would there be a difference in the cell viability when we immerse the blood in music as opposed to keeping it in a quiet environment? A very simple idea. And of course, some of the best ideas are very simple. Anyway, it turned out, yes, absolutely. We took every piece of music that we tried, every genre that we tried, created a significant increase in the viability of the red blood cells. In those days, we weren't working with white blood cells, only the reds. But we were seeing increases like, for example, with classical music, say, for argument's sake, between 10 and 15%, but with popular music, more like 18 to 20% increase in the viability. And this was a bit of a head scratcher at the time. We were.
Yeah, I would have guessed the reverse if you'd asked me to guess.
Exactly. So many people would have said, and intuitively, we thought that the classical music would provide the best result. And but no, it was counterintuitive what actually happened. And so after we performed the first few experiments with classical music and then with pop music, and we saw these results, we then had lunch and we were chatting about it over lunch. What could be the mechanism, and why is it that the classical music is providing such a relatively poor result compared with popular music that has a really pounding bass beat, right? Well, what then happened was, this is where the magic of cymatics comes into the equation, because without cymatics, we probably would never have known the answer. But what we decided was that this little speaker here in the incubator, I'll just turn this off again, look. This little speaker has what's termed a roll-off frequency of about 80 hertz. It's pretty low frequency for a little speaker, but nowhere near as good as, you know, a really great studio monitor speaker, for example, or a, you know, excellent stereo system speaker that you might have, you might pay $1,000 for or whatever, you know.
Yes.
They have a really great low frequency response going down to, say, 35 or 40 hertz compared with this little speaker at 80 hertz, right? So we were thinking, you know, could it be something to do with the fact that the classical music has relatively poor bass register? You know, I mean, it's classical, and we know that some classical pieces have, you know, excellent bass register, because you think of the 1812 overture by Tchaikovsky, or, you know, something like that. But most classical music is really kind of mid-range and upper frequencies mainly, right? And whereas every pop music track that we tried had a throbbing, you know, pulsating bass beat, right? So we were thinking maybe it's something to do with that. Okay, how do we test this? Well, let's put some blood into the cymascope instrument itself, which has a frequency response that goes down to 3 hertz, very low frequency response, right? So we put some blood into the cymascope instrument, and then we injected, as we call it, a pure, very pure tone, a single frequency tone into the blood. And what then happened was kind of magical, because the pattern appeared on the surface of the blood. Okay, you know, blood is nearly entirely water, right? It's like very high percentage of water, 95% or something water. So it wasn't a surprise to us, Meredith, that we saw a beautiful pattern emerge on the surface of the blood. That was no big surprise. We've expected it. What was the big surprise was when we removed that sound, that tone, the pattern remained in the blood, right? Now, that does not happen with water. With water, the organizational ability of sound frequencies, whether it be music or a single tone, creates this beautiful order in the water. But as soon as you release that sound, as soon as you stop the sound, the pattern vanishes. And of course, the water molecules, under what's termed Brownian motion, will immediately kind of distribute, and the pattern of organization will break up very, very quickly. But with the blood, there was this pattern, a beautiful pattern sitting on the surface of the blood. And the difference, how we saw this pattern, is in color, because when the blood arrives from the blood donor bank, it's very, very dark red. It's kind of like a dark maroon color. And but as soon as sound entered into the blood, it became bright scarlet immediately in the pattern. So what we were left seeing when the sound was removed was this beautiful scarlet pattern in the blood. And it stayed there for about 20 minutes. It just dissolved away very, very slowly. We just sat and watched it, you know, over a period of time. Excuse me one moment. Oh, there's a little pump in the lab here. Anyway, so that was an amazing moment for both of us. And we realized immediately what the implications of this were. And it's as follows. In the circulatory system of your body, you have a heart, which is a pump. It's essential ingredient in obviously keeping you alive. It's pumping the blood around your body, therefore pumping around your body the oxygen that's already dissolved in the blood that comes from your respiration, from your breathing, right? That is an essential way that we live, right? If you stop the heart, we know what happens. You lose consciousness within seconds. Why? Because the brain in particular needs a lot of oxygen. Okay, so we'll come back to that in a moment. What we came to realize was that the low frequencies in the popular music with this throbbing, pulsing bass beat were actually causing the oxygen dissolved in the blood to bind to the hemoglobin molecules in the red blood cells, therefore engorging them with oxygen and causing them to turn bright scarlet. Okay. So that was the fundamental, the secret, if you like, that came from the cymatic experiment. Without that cymatic experiment, we might never have known what the mechanism was. So now you can visualize that whenever sound enters into your body, particularly from popular music, it's actually doing a very similar job to a heartbeat. Every time you have a heartbeat, it isn't just literally circulating the blood around your body. Of course, it is doing that. But it's also, if you think about it, it's a pulse of low frequency sound. That's what it is. It's low frequency sound. And it's that sound that causes the oxygen to bind to the hemoglobin. No sound, no heartbeat, no binding, then you lose consciousness. Okay. So it's an amazing discovery that was made simply through, again, using the cymascope instrument. But let me now just go on to talk
Could I
about.
just ask a quick question? So is that that sound range that you're talking about, the bass and the popular music, would that be a similar sound like to drumming?
Yes,
Like that
absolutely.
low? And could that be why drum circles and drumming are such a prevalent part of human civilization throughout time?
Yes, yes. Obviously, low frequency sound from drums are all, and which are also usually rhythmically played. Not that the rhythm is particularly important in this case, but certainly the rhythm, can help to entrain the body and the brain into altered states and so on. We know this about drumming. But in addition to that, what has not been known until now, until we perform these experiments, is that the drumming also helps to oxygenate the body through this mechanism, right? And so now you can see a future, in which hospital beds will actually contain low frequency transducers so that when a patient needs oxygen, instead of giving them it literally, through their mouth and nose, they could literally support the patient with low frequency sound. And of course, I'm not talking about a pure tone here, which would be extremely boring to receive. Imagine now a low frequency sound that is pulsating, very much like the wave action. You know how the waves are beautiful to listen to, waves of the ocean. Well, imagine now a rhythmic pulsation coming up through the bed, and not from one spot, but rhythmically moving up and down the body in a very beautiful pulsating kind of rhythmic way. And that would be actually soothing to the patient. And not only would it help the oxygenation levels of the patient, and by the way, oxygen is the key ingredient in the body for almost all of the healing mechanisms in the body are powered by oxygen. So if there's more oxygen available to the patient, then of course it's going to speed their recovery from hospital. But the other beautiful thing that this pulsation in the bed would do is to help the lymph fluids move. You probably know that lymph fluids are, which remove the toxins from the body, are really only moved through movement. Well, if you've got a patient lying in bed prone, there's very little movement, and so the lymph tends to stagnate. So now if you think about the benefits of this pulsation method that I'm referring to, wow, it really could change the shape of medical science. All came out of one cymatic experiment.
Yes.
So kind of picture.
So that's incredible that that cymascope was able to lead to the mechanism of causation, because that's always seems to be the missing thing. You have all this evidence that sound healing is effective, but it's like, okay, but how? And so you came to that. And I just want to share a personal story that you've just given new meaning to. So when I was pregnant with my third child, she was past her due date, and my older children's school had a family drum night. And I said to my husband, I'm like, maybe we'll drum the baby out. So we went to family drum night, and we were in a big circle with parents and children and some professional drummers, and everyone had a drum, drumming and drumming and drumming. And sure enough, that night I went into labor.
Wow, very good. Well,
Now I know why. So thank you
yeah,
for
you would have had a
that.
lot more oxygen, and the baby, would have had a lot more oxygen because of that drumming for sure. There are many other, I don't know how much time we have left, Meredith, but there are many other mechanisms that relate to that where music, particularly music, is wonderful for actually changing the whole health of a person. If they're, for example, I'll give you one example here of many, but we could literally talk for an hour or more on this subject. But one of the examples that is very important, and I think I'd like to mention it now, just in case we run out of time, is chronic inflammation. There are millions and millions of people in the world who are suffering from chronic inflammation. Now, inflammation is a very good thing in the body, acute inflammation. It's actually essential to healing. You have to have acute inflammation. It's one of the mechanisms that the body uses to catalyze all of the healing responses. But chronic inflammation is a very bad thing. And it's caused, well, there are many causes for it, but the little cytokines that in the bloodstream, there are essentially two types of cytokines that fight with each other. They're literally having a battle. And once this occurs in the body, because of, say, toxicity that you've imbibed from, I don't know, vegetables that you haven't washed properly or whatever it is, there are many different ways that you can ultimately end up with chronic inflammation. Even stress can cause it ultimately. It causes an imbalance in the body and a movement away from homeostasis. But anyway, whatever the reason for it, it's extremely difficult to reverse medically. In fact, if you go to any clinician with this problem, they will be able to ease your symptoms with various, medications, but there is no pharmacological answer to chronic inflammation. However, various researchers, and this is not my research I'm going to refer to now, but various researchers around the world have now found and compared notes on this subject that by stimulating the vagus nerve in one's body, which is the longest nerve in the body, leaves the brain stem and goes to virtually all of the organs in the body, that when the vagus nerve is optimally stimulated, within a very short, relatively short period of time, within a few weeks, the chronic inflammation is completely eradicated, right? So this is extremely important. It hasn't really made it into mainstream medicine yet, but it will eventually. Yes. And in this case, it's you stimulate the vagus nerve not through speaker system, but through really high quality headphones. Because when the vagus nerve first leaves the brain stem, right, it branches off straight away to what's termed the tragus of the ears. This is this little flap of tissue, if you can see it on my own ear here, that overhangs the auditory canal. So if we don't want to hear what someone's saying, or if there's a very loud sound and we want to try and stop it, protect our ears, we press on the tragus, and that effectively closes off the ear canal, auditory canal, and to a large extent, mutes the sound coming in. Well, that tragus is literally where the vagus nerve first terminates. It branches to both ears when it leaves the brain stem. It then immediately goes to the pharynx and the larynx. And this is also very good news. I'll come back to that in a second. But the tragus of the ears, what this means, Meredith, is that we can access the vagus nerve very easily with low frequency sound. Again, these low frequencies are very important for stimulating the vagus nerve from beautiful music, right? So now imagine a scenario where you're wearing high quality headphones. Why high quality? Because they have a very good low frequency response. And then your vagus nerve will be stimulated optimally. Not only will it eradicate, completely mediate chronic inflammation in your body, but other researchers and other studies have found that when your vagus nerve is optimally stimulated, it slows the rate at which you age. And I think everyone is interested in that.
Yes.
It also has an effect on libido, on your sexual function. So it has many different benefits to come from this kind of stimulation. So now imagine a scenario like I painted a picture for you earlier of this patient lying in the bed receiving extra oxygen through the low frequency transducers and simultaneously hearing beautiful music coming through their ears that's stimulating their vagus nerve with so many health benefits, all arising without any pharmacological substance involved. So no toxicity in the body whatsoever.
It's incredible. And I'm thinking of rock stars who have somehow managed to stay in their prime well into their 70s. And I'm wondering if it's from all of this.
I think you've made a very good point there. I'm thinking of Mick Jagger, for example.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking of.
I mean, my God, he's still going strong.
And I'm also thinking too, like I think people are intuitively drawn to that. My teenage daughter, she was going through a really hard time, and she would turn out all the lights, lie down on the floor in the dark, and listen to a favorite album over and over. And then she'd say like, okay, it's done its job now. And she'd like move on and she'd move on.
Oh, wonderful.
It's so interesting. And then I was recently buying a gift for my son, and I saw in this store that curates their to audio files, they called them. And yeah, there were headsets and earpieces that were $3,000, $4,000, $5,000.
Yes.
And they were saying that is because of what you're referring to, like the quality of the frequencies that are coming through. And I'm just wondering if people are naturally drawn to seek that out without even understanding this information. They just know that it's
perhaps. But let me say, very quickly here, because for those people who think that, well, they should go out and buy a set of really good headphones, you can pay that kind of money. There are some really, audiophiles. These are
it seemed insane to me, but
people who spend,
sorry, are those earphones? Why are they so expensive?
I know, but anyway, listen, because there's a model of headphone called Beyer Dynamic, Beyer Dynamic, and the model number is DT770 Pro. Now, this headphone, it has a frequency response that starts at 5 hertz and it goes up to 35,000 hertz. And yet it's only, I don't know, it's not much more than $100, right? So it's really great value for money compared with many headphones that are really silly money, into the thousands.
That is good to know.
It is. So for those people who might want to go out and buy a set of Beyer Dynamic headphones, DT770 Pro, when you get to Amazon or wherever it is you're going to buy these from, you'll find that there are 3 different ohmic values given. They'll tell you that there's a 32 ohm model, there's an 80 ohm model, and there's a 250 ohm model. Ohm is the resistance of the headphone. It's OHM is the spelling. But anyway, so what does this mean? Well, the 32 ohm model is suitable for all Android powered devices and also for home stereo systems, for example, and also for your PC if you have a personal computer. Whereas the 80 ohm model is suitable for all Apple devices, computers, everything, basically everything Apple would be 80 ohm.
Okay.
And the 250 ohm model, forget it. That's only for studio applications. So you don't even have to think about that one. So there, if anyone wants to avail themselves of really high quality headphones without paying a fortune, that's a really great model that I would highly recommend.
Thank you for that. That is very helpful. I'm glad to know we don't have to spend thousands of dollars to get the benefits. So one topic I wanted to touch on before we wrap up is the relationship between sound and infrared light in our bodies.
Sure, very happy to talk about that. Well, I think, just a little bit of science is needed here. It's very little. So, please bear with me just for a minute or so while I describe the science. So first of all, let's talk about sound, what sound is. Sound is the passing on of vibrations from one atom to the next, from one molecule to the next. So let's think about my voice now. In my larynx, I've got little flaps of folds of tissue that are vibrating with my, air coming up from my lungs. And now think about the air surrounding those little flaps of tissue as they're vibrating. The air is obviously being vibrated with those same frequencies, those same modulations of the vocal folds, right? That sound then emerges from my mouth and from my nose. It's colored a little bit by my sinus cavities. But what emerges from my mouth is not a sound wave. Forget this whole idea of sound waves. They just don't exist in nature. A wave, literally a sound wave that you might see, for example, on a spectrum analyzer or on an oscilloscope device, is a graph. It's a graph. It's an XY graph of the energy, in this case, of my vocal sound, say, made visible as a graph. But that's not the shape of the sound. The shape of the sound emerging from my mouth and nose is a bubble. It's spherical. All audible sounds are spherical, like bubble-like. So where does the term sound wave come from? Well, as the sound bubble is emerging from my mouth and nose, it is pulsating in and out as it expands with the vibrations, in this case, of my larynx. So it's literally vibrating in and out. And if you were to graph that vibration, that pulsation, it would look like a wave. But, if you were to ask anyone, almost anyone, what is the shape of sound, they would say it's a wave. And then you would say, well, show me that wave coming out of your mouth. And they would go like this. It doesn't exist in nature. So now let's talk about the relationship between sound and light. All of these atoms and molecules that are being vibrated, in this case by my larynx, are all jostling against each other and passing on the vibrations, very much like a chain of dominoes. But in this case, if we can visualize that in 3 dimensions, all spherically expanding. So that information is being passed on from atom to atom, molecule to molecule. That's the data, you could say, in my voice. But now let's think about, if we look at one single or one pair of atoms or one pair of molecules, and zoom down to them and let's have a look at them. Well, when we look at an atom or a molecule, what we find is it's surrounded by a magnetic shell. In science, this is called a magnetic moment. And when these 2 atoms or 2 molecules collide with each other to pass on the information, which is what sound is, then it's the magnetic shells of the atoms that are colliding. That's what collides. The particles inside the atom, if we can call them that, never touch each other. It's always just the magnetic shells. And whenever 2 magnetic shells contact each other, there has to be a release of electromagnetism. Now, you can prove this very quickly for yourself just by rubbing your hands together very, very vigorously. And when you do that, you obviously, you know what will happen. You will feel warmth. People talk about this in everyday language as friction. But what is friction? Friction is the slipping past each other of, in this case, trillions of atoms in one hand past trillions of atoms in your other hand. But it's the magnetic shells around the atoms that are literally slipping past each other. And every time that happens, there has to be a launch, a release of electromagnetism, because the atoms, literally the magnetic moments of the atoms are colliding with each other. And whenever that happens, light is created, right? This is how light is created. So whenever you have sound, there has to be light. You cannot separate the two. Every sound gives birth to light. And this is how it does it, because literally the magnetic moments of these atoms collide as you create the sound. And those same collisions, in science, they're called inelastic collisions, that creates light. And the light that's created is modulated by the frequencies of the sound. So now what happens is, if you were to go outside, for example, Meredith, and sing to the sky, to the stars, literally your voice is going to create an infrared bubble now, and this infrared bubble is going to zip up through the atmosphere because air doesn't unduly attenuate infrared light. That's why you can feel the warmth of the sun, right? So the infrared component of your voice sound is going to zip through the atmosphere and carry your song to the stars, literally out into the universe, where theory tells us it will travel forever unless it meets some dense matter. It will just keep on going. So this is it's a poetic thought, but also very real from a scientific viewpoint, that if you sing to the stars, you will literally be sending your song to the stars. And of course, the reverse is also true. The stars are singing to us. There's a science of it's called asteroseismology, where cosmologists, astronomers can listen in to the sounds of stars through this same principle that I'm mentioning, but in reverse. So anyway, coming to the body now, all of the sounds that are happening in your body all of the time. We talked earlier about Professor James Jimzewski and the song of the cell, right? All of the cells in your body are making sound, but they're also making light. And the light that's created from the mechanism I've just described is in the infrared spectrum. And this is why your body is warm, right? Because of all the trillions of biochemical reactions, which are sound in your body. And also, it turns out that the main mechanism by which cells communicate with each other, literally sending signals to each other, is in the infrared spectrum. So that's how they communicate. And also another wonderful thought is that every thought you have originates because of sound in the brain. Literally, the molecules in the neurons of the brain have to collide to create a thought. Well, when that happens, you create sound in the neurons of the brain, and that sound creates heat, right? And that heat, in other words, infrared, then cascades throughout your whole body, sending the signals of your brain to every cell of your body. And this is one of the main ways that the brain literally is able to connect with all of the cells in your body. So is that a short?
It's incredible. Yes, absolutely. So if we take it to the most quantum level possible, are light and sound really different, or are they part of the same thing?
Well, they're interconnected, but you can't convert sound to light. I know there's a lot of people, like to think that they can. They will take a sound frequency, multiply it by 40 octaves effectively, in other words, 40 times, to reach a light frequency, right? And then they'll say, oh, this piano note is equal to red or whatever. That is nonsense from a scientific viewpoint. I mean, it's a poetic idea, but you can't do it. Really, you can't do it in any kind of legitimate way. Why? Because sound is a completely different natural phenomena to light. Sound is literally a mechanical passing on of vibrations between atoms or molecules. Light is an electromagnetic phenomenon. So they're completely different aspects of nature, and you can't transpose one to the other. However, as we've said, sound gives birth to light. In fact, you cannot have light without sound. There is no light in the universe that occurs without sound. In fact, going right back to the biblical perspective and the words of this St. John's Gospel, in the beginning was the Word. Well, it turns out it's absolutely correct from a scientific viewpoint that first you have to have sound, you have to have the collisions, let's say, of the Big Bang, in order to create the light that then flooded out through the universe. So from a biblical perspective, they were spot on, right? Whoever wrote those words knew what they were talking about.
They got it. So sound gives birth to light.
It does.
This is just fascinating. So sound becomes an integral ingredient in healing. And I'm thinking about all of the research on the health benefits of, say, going for a walk in the forest. And then so you have all of the different, you have the bird song and the sound of the wind in the trees and
which
the
is
leaves
by the
or
way,
snow.
I love the word sirism. That the sound of the wind in the tree, it begins with a PS, and P. I can't remember the spelling now, but the word is sirism. I love that word. Anyway,
Hmm.
one of these days I might remember how to spell it. But sound of the wind in the trees, very much like the sound of the ocean breakers or the sound of a waterfall. All of these different natural sounds create ultrasound. So this is not just sound that you can hear. This is sound that's going way beyond what your ears can hear, way up into ultrasound frequencies. So like 40,000 hertz, 60,000 hertz. And these kind of frequencies are extraordinarily healing for the body. So when you say go for a walk in the forest and you hear the sound of the wind in the trees, then that's very, very healing to the body. And also many bird sounds, many bird songs actually also reach up into these ultrasound frequencies. Very often birds will sing way beyond what we can hear. So we're hearing their song, but we're not hearing the whole song. Part of the
Mm-hmm.
song is going up into the ultrasound region. And I actually read a paper not so long ago about the ecology that exists between bird song and plant life, for example, that there's literally a balance going on where the birds are literally helping the plants to grow through the ultrasound that they're creating.
Wow. That makes total sense.
Lovely
From
thought.
a quantum perspective, that is just beautiful.
Mm.
John, is there anything else you'd like to share before we wrap up? Any unproven theories dear to your heart or anything you're excited about?
Well, I am very excited about heterodyning, and this is all coming back to the vagus nerve again.
Mm-hmm.
We have two dear friends in Anders Holt and Kachina Miadu. These are two beautiful musicians from Denmark, and they make really gorgeous music. And one of their albums is called Dream of the Blue Whale. And Annalise, my wife, and I very often listen to it at breakfast time because it's so soothing and it just kind of washes over us as we're eating our meal. And anyway, knowing that the various researchers around the world had made this discovery about the low frequencies needed to optimally stimulate the vagus nerve, and I was so excited about that, reading that research. I thought, I wonder how deep, because Anders has this beautiful, deep, rich sound, vocal sound. I wondered how low his frequencies would go. And so this day, anyway, I went up from the lab into our home, brought down this album, and put it on our spectrum analyzer here in the lab to just have a look at it and see how low his frequencies would go. And I'd also had a chat with him, and I said, how low do you think your frequencies go? And he said, well, on a good day, maybe 60 hertz, And anyway, when I put it on the spectrum analyzer, boy, did I get a shock, because the frequencies that were coming out of that CD were down to the 12 hertz band on the analyzer. And this was a real
Wow.
mystery to me, because I had been, well, my first career was that of an acoustics engineer. I'm now an acoustic physics scientist, but look, you could say my whole career has been focused on sound, and yet I did not know this fact that it's possible to create these very low frequencies from, say, a digital file, or from, in this case, a CD player, a CD disc, right? And so anyway, to cut a long story short, because I know we're out of time, it turns out that only certain albums have this effect. It's not only Anders and Kachina's Dream of the Blue Whale, it's also many other albums that we have. Annalise and I have quite an eclectic taste in music, a lot of classical music, but also many other genres. And it turns out that not all albums have this effect. Some have it, some don't. It's still a mystery. But
Hmm.
one of the things I would like to point out is that when I see the 12 hertz band dancing up and down on the analyzer from the music, what I know, because of the shape of the filter curve that's created by, that there will be frequencies present as low as 4 and 5 hertz, right? And this is ideal. 5 hertz in particular is optimal for vagus nerve stimulation. So, it's called, the principle in electronics is called heterodyning, and it's very well known in electromagnetic frequencies like radio frequencies and things, but it's not known at all in audio. And I reached out to many of my colleagues, and nobody had heard of it. And so this is a great mystery a juicy, delicious mystery to get my teeth into at some point, and hopefully this year. But in the meantime, what's really great about this, and I'd be very happy to share it, with your viewers and your listeners, is that I've created a list of heterodyne albums from our own collection here that we now know for sure produce these really, really low frequencies. So all you have to do is to play any of the albums from that list, and you, via these good quality headphones, and you will receive optimal vagus nerve stimulation with all the benefits that come from that.
Oh, that is just beautiful. And that would be amazing. We would find a way to share that list with everybody. And just to end on it, you are in the process of launching the Cymascope Institute. How can people support that work or stay up to date on what you're working on?
Oh, it's very kind of you to suggest that. Well, we have the Cymascope website, and this is spelled CYMA, and then scope like microscope. Cymascope website. And on the home page, you'll actually see, if you scroll down, you'll see a button to the Cymascope Institute. It's a not-for-profit institute that we're in the process of forming. But even right now, you can donate to it any, $1, $5, whatever you can afford, and it will help us ultimately, because we have so much research that needs to be funded. So we are indeed self-funded, and the Cymascope Institute, because it will be a not-for-profit institute, we are then much more likely to attract sponsorship and donations and so on. But even now, you can make a donation to that, and it will help our research greatly. And and that website has so much wonderful information on it, all for free, obviously. And we also do have a shop which you can go to, and there's many different products in there, and all of them, any purchase at all, will ultimately come back into our lab here. That's how we support ourselves, through sales, through our shop.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for sharing that. And I know that our audience and our community will be very happy to support your work, because this type of research is so important. And, I know it's hard to get funding when you're not tied to a pharmaceutical outcome. So we are here for you, whatever you need.
So much. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast today. And I'd really love to come back, because, some of the subjects that we could talk about, like, for example, how this all began in my life, with the Great Pyramid experiments going way back to 1997. That was a fascinating, time in my life. And I'd love to share that.
That's true. We could do a whole podcast on that, but just quickly, do say what happened, because that is just such a phenomenal story. So you were a sound engineer becoming interested in research. You somehow set it up so that you could do an experiment inside the king's chamber in the pyramids which pyramids was it, in Giza or?
The Great Pyramid at Giza. Yeah, this is the largest of the Giza group pyramids.
Okay, so I'm going to set it up, and then you tell us what happens. So you go in, you set up your plate or your membrane with some particulate matter on it, and then you turn on the sound, and then tell us what happened.
Well, basically, in the King's Chamber, for those people who have not visited the Great Pyramid, and I'm sure that's probably most of your viewers and listeners, it has an extraordinary acoustic. It's very, very reverberant. So, reverberance is a little bit like echo, but it's much shorter time span. So there are many reflections reaching your ears just literally milliseconds after each other. The result is, if you make a sound in the king's chamber, then it lasts for quite a long time because it bounces around, very, very, very reverberant. Anyway, because at that time in my career, I was an acoustics engineer. Of course, I was really interested in the whole principle of this chamber. Had they deliberately designed it to be so, to be so reverberant? And for what reason? And then if you think of the sarcophagus, which is a block of granite that's been hollowed out and it weighs 3.7 tons. And this is Aswan granite, which is, from the far south in Egypt, Upper Egypt. And Aswan granite has a very high percentage of quartz crystal in it, like 20% quartz crystal. So if you strike the side of the sarcophagus with your fist, say, which is a bit naughty, but many people do it, it rings like a low-pitched bell. It's so beautiful, the sound. Anyway, so I was really interested in that, from an acoustic standpoint. I wanted to map the resonances of that granite box. So cutting this very, very short, instead of lying in the sarcophagus, which I did the very first time and making sound by lying in it, I put a small speaker there instead. And then I stretched a membrane, in this case PVC, across the open top of the sarcophagus. All of this in front of the antiquities inspector who was there, the whole time, to make sure I didn't do any damage to this priceless sarcophagus, I guess. Anyway, what happened was so extraordinary and changed my life forever, Meredith. And what happened was when I sprinkle sand on the membrane, and by the way, this is sand that I had collected literally outside of the pyramid, because they got plenty of sand in Egypt. When I sprinkled sand on the membrane and turned on this low frequency sound from the electronic oscillator, what happened was a whole series of what looked like ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs began to appear in the sand. And the antiquities inspector was so excited. And I was excited as well, of course. I mean, who wouldn't be, seeing these ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs appear in the sand? But the other really important life-changing aspect to this for me was that I had entered the pyramid that day in great pain because I had injured my back 3 weeks earlier. So much so I thought I was going to have to cancel the whole mission. But somehow I just, I took probably way too many analgesics and gritted my teeth and somehow managed to get myself in there. But even, this is such an important part of the story, because within 20 minutes of making sound in the chamber and seeing these hieroglyphs, the pain in my back completely left me and it never came back. So what that said to me in that moment was that something kind of magical had happened. How is it that all these analgesics hadn't really touched that pain? I'd even been to a physiotherapist a couple of times. They hadn't been able to do anything either. I was still in great pain, but 20 minutes of making sound, no pain, and it never came back. Well, that was a real, eye opener for me, and it changed my life. Because two things. First, what was the mechanism that underpinned, that stimulation of my body to literally reverse the pain and to heal myself, basically. And then the other thing was the cymatics experiment had been so phenomenally successful, seeing these ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. What? Well, that said to me, this potentially could be a new tool for science. And that was the journey that I started that day, literally, to this point, where I now do understand many of the mechanisms, including the mechanism that healed my back that day. I now know how that happened because of the sound. And then, of course, the other aspect is the manifestation of the cymascope in the world. We now have a cymascope instrument that can make sound visible in pure water. All of that came from that cymatics experiment that day in 1997.
Wow. It's just so incredible when we follow our intuition to do something that sounds crazy, and look what you discovered. So I just want to clarify. So there was a membrane with a random scattering of sand on it, And when you
Right.
played the sound, so I mentioned this earlier, the sand was organized itself into very beautiful, coherent geometric shapes. But when you did this experiment inside the pyramid, and specifically the king's chamber, the sand spontaneously organized itself into ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs.
Yeah, I want to be clear here that not every frequency created a hieroglyph. Some of the frequencies did create some geometry, such as we would
Yes,
typically see, right?
right.
Got many photographs of that nature. But then in between these geometric shapes and cymatic patterns, in between those, we saw other shapes, such as like you might think of as a coral sea, like very, very strange,
Mhm.
otherworldly kind of shapes. But then in between those, then suddenly would appear a hieroglyph. And the very first
Unbelievable.
hieroglyph that appeared was the Jed, what's called the Jed pillar, DJED pillar, which represents the hieroglyph for the backbone of the god Osiris. And this wasn't static on the membrane, by the way, Meredith. This was snaking in a kind of very dynamic way.
Oh
And
my
oh my
God.
God, it was really, oh,
This
well,
is
the
so
pigment
crazy.
inspector and myself were like, what? It was really an astonishing moment in my life. And probably many of your viewers and listeners are thinking, I know why his back pain left him. It was because he was so excited and his blood was flowing with endorphins. Well, that exact thought had occurred to me in that moment, actually. But it turns out, of course, that the pain did not leave me. Sorry, did not come back. So the endorphins, of course, the effective endorphins, when you're excited, and of
Hmm.
course, the blood's flowing with these wonderful, opioids, natural opioids, endogenous opioids. Of course, that would wear off within a matter of an hour or two, when
Yeah.
the experiment stops. But in this case, the pain never came back. So it wasn't just a masking of the pain, although I'm sure that was probably part of the mechanism. But there's another mechanism that I can go into another time, but that I do now understand fully. And it's all coming back to oxygen in the body. So
Okay.
yeah, so we can talk about that
So
another.
basically the sound triggered a healing mechanism in your body
It
with
did
much scientific detail we won't go into at the moment, and your pain was resolved.
relating to hypoxia. Yeah, but yeah, as you say, we can like.
Oh, fabulous. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing your research. It's so compelling, and it's just really adding to the world in our understanding of how not only to heal, but to maintain our health so we can avoid the epidemic of health crises that seem to be happening. Thank you for your contribution.
Indeed, Meredith, and thank you so much for having me on your podcast. I really enjoyed our conversation
It
today.
was really fun. Thank you.
Bye bye.
Woohoo! You made it to the end of another episode. Thank you so much for joining us on this exploratory adventure into new realms. Your energy and support are building a different world, and I am so grateful to be on this journey with you. Take care and thanks.